hidden teachings of Jesus. Were the Gnostics right? What if I told you that some early Christians believed Jesus came not to save people from their sins, but to help them unlock a secret knowledge that would set them free? These Christians, called the Gnostics, saw Jesus not as a savior who died for humanity's sins, but as a teacher of hidden wisdom. Their lost writings, like the Gospel of Thomas, reveal a Jesus unlike the one found in the Bible. But why were these teachings banned, and what secrets did they hold? The word Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. The Gnostics believed that true salvation didn't come from following rules or believing in a crucified Messiah. It came from discovering a hidden spiritual truth within themselves. These ideas were powerful, even dangerous, to the early Christian church. Many of their writings were destroyed, and their beliefs were labeled as heresy. But today, scholars have uncovered some of these lost gospels, shedding new light on who Jesus might have been and what he really taught. If Gnostic Christians were just another branch of early Christianity, why did the church work so hard to erase their teachings? To answer that, we have to look at how Christianity developed in the first few centuries after Jesus' death. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christian leaders were trying to define their faith. They wanted a clear, unified message, one that said Jesus was the Son of God, that he died for humanity's sins, and that salvation came through faith in him. But the Gnostics challenged this idea. They didn't believe in a single, all-powerful church. They didn't even think Jesus' death was the most important part of his story. To the Gnostics, Jesus was a guide, not a sacrifice. They believed he came to teach people how to awaken their divine spark, an inner connection to God that had been hidden by ignorance and illusion. This was a direct challenge to the growing power of the early church, which emphasized obedience, authority, and faith in church teachings. The Gnostics, on the other hand, taught that each person had to seek truth for themselves. If everyone could find their own path to God, what role would the church play? This made the Gnostics a threat, and over time their texts were banned. By the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, Gnostic writings were almost completely wiped out. But some of them survived, hidden away for centuries, and when they were finally rediscovered, they revealed a very different Jesus than the one most people know. One of the most famous Gnostic texts is the Gospel of Thomas, discovered in 1945 in Egypt. Unlike the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, Thomas doesn't tell the story of Jesus' life, death, or resurrection. Instead, it's a collection of secret sayings, words Jesus supposedly spoke in private to his closest followers. Many of these sayings are mysterious, even puzzling. Take this one. If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have that within you, what you do not have will destroy you. What does that mean? Unlike the familiar Christian message of faith and salvation, this sounds more like a call to self-discovery. The Gnostics believed that people carried a divine spark within them, but they had to find it. The problem was that the world around them, created by an imperfect and even evil God, according to some Gnostics, kept them in darkness. Jesus' role was to help them see past this illusion. Another Gnostic text, the Gospel of Mary, presents an even more radical idea that Mary Magdalene was one of Jesus' closest disciples, maybe even closer to him than Peter. In this text, Mary receives secret teachings from Jesus after his resurrection, but when she shares them with the male disciples, they don't believe her. Peter even questions whether Jesus would have chosen to reveal such important knowledge to a woman. This gospel challenges not only traditional views of Jesus, but also the role of women in early Christianity. The Gospel of Philip goes even further. It suggests that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were deeply connected, perhaps even married. One passage describes how Jesus often kissed Mary, though the text is damaged and the exact meaning is unclear. If true, this would completely change the way we think about Jesus and his relationships. But the most shocking idea from the Gnostics is that the physical world is a prison. In mainstream Christianity, God is the loving creator of everything. But some Gnostic texts describe the material world as a trap, ruled by a lower, imperfect God called the Demiurge. This being, they believed, created the world not to help humans, but to keep them in ignorance. This was a direct attack on the beliefs of early Christian leaders. If the God of the Old Testament was actually a lesser being, And if Jesus didn't come to die for sins but to reveal secret knowledge, then everything about traditional Christianity would be turned upside down. In some Gnostic writings, Jesus even laughs at the idea of his own crucifixion. He tells his followers that the physical body doesn't matter, that what's truly important is the spirit within. One text, the second treatise of the great Seth, has Jesus saying, "They crucified their man, but I was not afflicted." To Gnostics, the real Jesus wasn't suffering on the cross. The real Jesus had already escaped because he had discovered the hidden truth, and he wanted his followers to do the same. But if that's true, then why did the early church reject these ideas? And what happened to the Gnostics as Christianity became more powerful? The battle between the Gnostics and the early church wasn't just about different beliefs, it was about control. If Jesus had truly taught secret knowledge, and if salvation came from personal discovery rather than faith in church teachings, then the power of the church itself was in danger. The leaders of what would become mainstream Christianity couldn't allow this. One of the most influential figures in this struggle was Irenaeus, a Christian bishop in the 2nd century. He saw Gnosticism as a major threat and wrote an entire book called Against Heresies, attacking their beliefs. He argued that there could only be one true version of Christianity, the version based on the 4 Gospels that we now find in the New Testament. He claimed that Gnostic writings were false, their teachings dangerous, and that Jesus had never given any secret knowledge to his followers. The church took this message seriously. By the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Emperor Constantine, Gnostic texts were being actively destroyed. Church leaders gathered to decide which books would be part of the Bible, and the Gnostic Gospels were left out. Those who continued to follow Gnostic beliefs were labeled heretics, and many were persecuted. Their writings were banned, and in some cases, entire communities were wiped out. But not everything was lost. Some Gnostic believers hid their sacred texts, burying them in places where they might one day be found. This is how in 1945, a farmer in Egypt discovered a collection of ancient books buried in a jar. These texts, known as the Nag Hammadi Library, contain some of the most important Gnostic writings, including the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Apocryphon of John. When scholars began translating these texts, they were shocked. The ideas they found inside didn't just challenge traditional Christianity, they rewrote everything we thought we knew about early Christian history. They showed that in the first centuries after Jesus, there wasn't just one version of Christianity. There were many, and for a time, Gnosticism was one of the strongest. One of the most controversial ideas found in the Apocryphon of John is the story of the Demiurge, a false god who created the physical world. According to this text, the true God is beyond human understanding, pure light, pure spirit. But the Demiurge, an ignorant and arrogant being, believed himself to be the only God. He created the world as a prison, keeping humans trapped in their material bodies and preventing them from realizing their divine nature. This, the Gnostics said, is why the world is full of suffering, corruption, and injustice. This idea was a direct attack on the authority of the church. If the God of the Old Testament, the God who gave Moses the 10 Commandments, was actually a lower, imperfect being, then what did that say about the laws of mainstream Christianity? What did that say about sin, obedience, and the entire structure of the church? The Gnostics believed that Jesus came to free people from the control of the Demiurge. He didn't come to die for sins. He came to wake people up, to help them escape the illusions of the material world. To them, the crucifixion wasn't a sacrifice for humanity's sins, but a deception. Some texts even suggest that Jesus wasn't really crucified at all, that he only appeared to die while his true self remained untouched. This was another major reason the early church rejected Gnosticism. If Jesus' death wasn't the key to salvation, then the entire foundation of Orthodox Christianity was in question. The church relied on the belief that Jesus' suffering and resurrection were necessary for human salvation. But the Gnostics taught that salvation didn't come from Jesus' death. It came from discovering the truth within. Another reason Gnostic ideas were so dangerous to the early church was their view of authority. In Orthodox Christianity, salvation required faith in Jesus and obedience to the church. The church was seen as the guardian of truth, with priests and bishops acting as intermediaries between God and the people. But the Gnostics rejected this system. They believed that each person had a direct connection to the divine and didn't need priests or churches to guide them. This is why figures like Mary Magdalene were so important in Gnostic texts. In the Gospel of Mary, Jesus teaches Mary privately, giving her knowledge that even the male disciples don't receive. When she shares this wisdom, Peter and the others refuse to believe her, showing the divide between those who accept secret knowledge and those who cling to traditional beliefs. This wasn't just a challenge to Christian theology, it was a challenge to the entire structure of the church. If knowledge and salvation were personal, then what role did bishops, priests, and religious leaders have? If people didn't need the church to reach God, then the church itself lost its power. By the 4th century, these ideas were nearly erased from history. The Council of Nicaea, called by Emperor Constantine in 325 CE, helped establish the foundation of mainstream Christianity. This council confirmed that Jesus was the Son of God, that he was crucified for humanity's sins, and that belief in him was the only path to salvation. Gnostic ideas were condemned, their followers pushed into hiding or forced to convert. Over time, Gnosticism faded. The church grew stronger, and Gnostic texts disappeared. For more than 1,000 years, the only information about Gnosticism came from the writings of its enemies. People like Irenaeus, who described it as a dangerous and false belief. The real teachings of the Gnostics were lost, until they were found again. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945 changed everything. Suddenly, scholars had access to the actual words of the Gnostics, not just the writings of those who opposed them. They could see for themselves what these early Christians believed, how they viewed Jesus, and why the church tried to silence them. The revelations were shocking. They showed that early Christianity was far more diverse than anyone had imagined. They revealed a Jesus who spoke in riddles, who taught personal enlightenment instead of obedience, and who may have even rejected the idea of a single, all-powerful God. But this discovery raised even more questions. If Gnosticism had survived longer, would Christianity look different today? What other lost teachings might still be hidden, waiting to be found? And most importantly, was there truth in what the Gnostics believed? The battle between the Gnostics and the early church wasn't just about different beliefs. It was about control. If Jesus had truly taught secret knowledge, and if salvation came from personal discovery rather than faith in church teachings, then the power of the church itself was in danger. The leaders of what would become mainstream Christianity couldn't allow this. One of the most influential figures in this struggle was Irenaeus, a Christian bishop in the 2nd century. He saw Gnosticism as a major threat and wrote an entire book called Against Heresies, attacking their beliefs. He argued that there could only be one true version of Christianity, the version based on the 4 Gospels that we now find in the New Testament. He claimed that Gnostic writings were false, their teachings dangerous, and that Jesus had never given any secret knowledge to his followers. The church took this message seriously. By the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Emperor Constantine, Gnostic texts were being actively destroyed. Church leaders gathered to decide which books would be part of the Bible, and the Gnostic Gospels were left out. Those who continued to follow Gnostic beliefs were labeled heretics, and many were persecuted. Their writings were banned, and in some cases, entire communities were wiped out. But not everything was lost. Some Gnostic believers hid their sacred texts, burying them in places where they might one day be found. This is how, in 1945, a farmer in Egypt discovered a collection of ancient books buried in a jar. These texts, known as the Nag Hammadi Library, contain some of the most important Gnostic writings, including the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Apocryphon of John. When scholars began translating these texts, they were shocked. The ideas they found inside didn't just challenge traditional Christianity. They rewrote everything we thought we knew about early Christian history. They showed that in the first centuries after Jesus, there wasn't just one version of Christianity. There were many. And for a time, Gnosticism was one of the strongest. One of the most controversial ideas found in the Apocryphon of John is the story of the Demiurge, a false god who created the physical world. According to this text, the true God is beyond human understanding, pure light, pure spirit. But the Demiurge, an ignorant and arrogant being, believed himself to be the only God. He created the world as a prison, keeping humans trapped in their material bodies and preventing them from realizing their divine nature. This, the Gnostics said, is why the world is full of suffering, corruption, and injustice. This idea was a direct attack on the authority of the church. If the God of the Old Testament, the God who gave Moses the Ten Commandments, was actually a lower, imperfect being, then what did that say about the laws of mainstream Christianity? What did that say about sin, obedience, and the entire structure of the church? The Gnostics believed that Jesus came to free people from the control of the demiurge. He didn't come to die for sins. He came to wake people up, to help them escape the illusions of the material world. To them, the crucifixion wasn't a sacrifice for humanity's sins, but a deception. Some texts even suggest that Jesus wasn't really crucified at all, that he only appeared to die while his true self remained untouched. This was another major reason the early church rejected Gnosticism. If Jesus' death wasn't the key to salvation, then the entire foundation of Orthodox Christianity was in question. The church relied on the belief that Jesus' suffering and resurrection were necessary for human salvation. But the Gnostics taught that salvation didn't come from Jesus' death. It came from discovering the truth within. Another reason Gnostic ideas were so dangerous to the early church was their view of authority. In Orthodox Christianity, salvation required faith in Jesus and obedience to the church. The church was seen as the guardian of truth, with priests and bishops acting as intermediaries between God and the people. But the Gnostics rejected this system. They believed that each person had a direct connection to the divine and didn't need priests or churches to guide them. This is why figures like Mary Magdalene were so important in Gnostic texts. In the Gospel of Mary, Jesus teaches Mary privately, giving her knowledge that even the male disciples don't receive. When she shares this wisdom, Peter and the others refuse to believe her, showing the divide between those who accept secret knowledge and those who cling to traditional beliefs. This wasn't just a challenge to Christian theology, it was a challenge to the entire structure of the church. If knowledge and salvation were personal, then what role did bishops, priests, and religious leaders have? If people didn't need the church to reach God, then the church itself lost its power. By the 4th century, these ideas were nearly erased from history. The Council of Nicaea, called by Emperor Constantine in 325 CE, helped establish the foundation of mainstream Christianity. This council confirmed that Jesus was the Son of God, that he was crucified for humanity's sins, and that belief in him was the only path to salvation. Gnostic ideas were condemned, their followers pushed into hiding, or forced to convert. Over time, Gnosticism faded. The church grew stronger, and Gnostic texts disappeared. For more than 1,000 years, the only information about Gnosticism came from the writings of its enemies. People like Irenaeus, who described it as a dangerous and false belief. The real teachings of the Gnostics were lost, until they were found again. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945 changed everything. Suddenly, scholars had access to the actual words of the Gnostics, not just the writings of those who opposed them. They could see for themselves what these early Christians believed, how they viewed Jesus, and why the church tried to silence them. The revelations were shocking. They showed that early Christianity was far more diverse than anyone had imagined. They revealed a Jesus who spoke in riddles, who taught personal enlightenment instead of obedience, and who may have even rejected the idea of a single, all-powerful God. But this discovery raised even more questions. If Gnosticism had survived longer, would Christianity look different today? What other lost teachings might still be hidden, waiting to be found? And most importantly, was there truth in what the Gnostics believed? The rediscovery of Gnostic texts not only revealed forgotten beliefs, but also reignited a centuries-old debate. What if the history of early Christianity had unfolded differently? What if Gnostic ideas had not been condemned as heresy, but had instead been preserved alongside the teachings that became Orthodox Christianity? These questions became even more pressing as scholars examined the ways in which Gnosticism influenced religious thought long after its suppression. One of the most striking aspects of Gnostic belief was its radical reinterpretation of Jesus' mission. Traditional Christianity teaches that Jesus came to die for the sins of humanity, an act of divine sacrifice that grants salvation to those who believe in him. The Gnostics, however, saw things differently. For them, Jesus was not a savior in the sense of taking away sins. He was a teacher, a revealer of hidden truths. His purpose was not to die for humanity, but to awaken people to the reality that they had been trapped in a world of illusion, ruled by a false god. This idea stood in direct opposition to the teachings of the early church, which placed enormous emphasis on Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. According to Gnostic writings like the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Thomas, salvation did not come from Jesus' death, but from understanding the divine knowledge he shared. This knowledge, or gnosis, was not about following religious laws or obeying church authority. It was about an inner realization of one's true nature. This emphasis on personal enlightenment made Gnosticism dangerous to the church. If salvation was an individual journey of discovery, then the church had no role as an intermediary between people and God. The Gnostics believed that divine knowledge was accessible to all who sought it, not just to those who followed church teachings. In their view, priests, bishops, and religious leaders were unnecessary, even misleading, because they promoted a version of Christianity that kept people spiritually asleep. Another major challenge Gnosticism posed to the early church was its view of the material world. Orthodox Christianity teaches that God created the world and called it good. The physical body, though weak and prone to sin, is seen as part of God's creation, and resurrection is a key belief. Jesus' own bodily resurrection is proof that the faithful will also be raised from the dead at this end of time. But the Gnostics rejected this entirely. To them, the physical world was not created by the true God. Instead, it was the work of the demiurge, a lower and imperfect being who mistakenly believed himself to be the ultimate God. This world, they said, was filled with suffering, corruption, and ignorance, precisely because it was not the creation of a benevolent deity. The true divine realm was beyond the material world, and the only way to reach it was to escape the cycle of physical existence. This led to another sharp contrast between Gnosticism and Orthodox Christianity, the belief in resurrection. While the church taught that Jesus' resurrection was the foundation of faith, Gnostic texts suggested that resurrection was not physical, but spiritual. The Gospel of Philip, for example, says, "Those who say they will die first and then rise are mistaken. If they do not first receive the resurrection while they are alive, when they die, they will receive nothing." This statement implies that resurrection is not about the body at all. It is about attaining enlightenment while still alive. This was a radical departure from the beliefs that became mainstream Christianity. If resurrection was spiritual rather than physical, then Jesus' own resurrection was not a literal event but a symbol of inner transformation. This would mean that the stories of Jesus' empty tomb and physical appearances after death were not meant to be taken as historical facts, but as metaphors for a deeper spiritual awakening. The early church could not accept this interpretation. Christianity was built on the belief that Jesus' resurrection was a real physical event, proof of his divine nature and the promise of eternal life for believers. To question this was to challenge the very core of Christian faith. The idea that Jesus had simply taught secret wisdom, rather than literally rising from the dead, was unacceptable to church leaders who sought to unify Christianity under a single authoritative doctrine. This is why the Gnostic texts were declared heretical. The church needed to establish a clear distinction between acceptable beliefs and dangerous deviations. By the 4th century, with the support of the Roman Empire, Christian leaders formalized doctrine, choosing which texts would be included in the Bible and which would be rejected. The Gnostic Gospels were excluded, labeled as false teachings, and eventually banned. But even as Gnostic beliefs were suppressed, their influence persisted. Echoes of Gnostic thought can be found in later religious and mystical traditions, from medieval heresies like the Cathars to modern spiritual movements that emphasize inner enlightenment over institutional religion. The idea that salvation comes from personal knowledge rather than obedience to a religious authority remains a powerful challenge to traditional Christianity. As scholars continue to study these ancient texts, new questions arise. Did Jesus truly intend for his teachings to be understood in the way the church has presented them for centuries? Or were the Gnostics preserving a hidden truth that was deliberately erased? And if so, what else has been lost to history, waiting to be rediscovered? The struggle between Gnosticism and Orthodox Christianity was not just about theology, it was also about power. The early church was in the process of defining itself, and anything that challenged its authority had to be confronted. As bishops and church leaders worked to unify Christian beliefs, Gnostic teachings posed a serious problem. If salvation came from personal enlightenment rather than church doctrine, what role did the church play? If hidden knowledge was the key to understanding Jesus, then why follow the official gospels and the teachings of religious leaders? The church's response was swift and decisive. By the late 2nd century, figures like Irenaeus of Lyons were writing against the Gnostics, calling their beliefs false and dangerous. In his work against heresies, Irenaeus argued that the Gnostic texts were distortions of true Christianity. He claimed that Jesus had passed down his teachings to the apostles, who had preserved them within the church. Any ideas outside of this tradition, he insisted, were lies. This argument became the foundation for the church's stance on Gnosticism. The bishops of the early church saw themselves as the protectors of Jesus' message, and they insisted that only the teachings passed down through the apostles were legitimate. The Gnostic texts, which often claimed to contain secret revelations, were seen as threats to this authority. The church could not allow individuals to interpret Jesus' teachings in their own way. It needed a unified belief system, one that could hold the growing Christian community together. As the Roman Empire's relationship with Christianity changed, the battle over Gnostic ideas intensified. In the early centuries, Christians had been persecuted by Roman authorities, but by the early 4th century, everything changed. Emperor Constantine not only legalized Christianity, but actively supported it, helping it become the dominant religion of the empire. With the backing of imperial power, church leaders now had the ability to decide which beliefs would be considered orthodox and which would be condemned as heresy. One of the most significant moments in this process was the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Although this council was primarily concerned with the nature of Jesus, specifically whether he was fully divine or created by God, it also played a role in shaping the boundaries of acceptable Christian belief. In the years that followed, the church would continue to define its doctrine, eventually leading to the creation of the biblical canon. The process of selecting which text would become part of the Bible was not as simple as many assume. In the early centuries, Christian communities used a variety of gospels, letters, and religious writings, many of which presented very different views of Jesus. Some churches read from the Gospel of Thomas, while others used the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Philip. But as church leaders sought to establish a single, authoritative set of scriptures, many of these texts were left out. By the late 4th century, the church had largely settled on the books that would become the New Testament. The 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were chosen as the only official accounts of Jesus' life, while texts like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas were declared heretical. These rejected writings were ordered to be destroyed, and for centuries they were thought to be lost forever. This effort to suppress Gnostic ideas was not just about religious doctrine, it was also about maintaining control. A unified set of beliefs meant a stronger, more organized church. It meant that bishops and priests could guide their followers with clear teachings, rather than leaving people to seek their own spiritual knowledge. By labeling Gnostic texts as dangerous, church leaders ensured that their version of Christianity would be the dominant one. But despite these efforts, traces of Gnostic thought continued to surface. In the Middle Ages, groups like the Bogomils and Cathars embraced ideas that closely resembled Gnosticism. They believed that the material world was evil, that salvation came through knowledge, and that the institutional church was corrupt. The Catholic Church saw them as heretics and launched brutal campaigns to destroy them, just as it had done with the Gnostics centuries earlier. Even today, the rediscovery of Gnostic texts has reignited debates about the true nature of early Christianity. Scholars now recognize that Christianity was not a single, unified faith in its early years, but a diverse and often conflicting collection of beliefs. The question remains, did the church preserve the true teachings of Jesus, or did it suppress alternative perspectives that might have changed the course of history? The lost Gospels offer a glimpse into what might have been, but they also raise deeper questions about power, faith, and the nature of truth. If history had taken a different path, how different would Christianity look today? And what else might still be hidden, waiting to be uncovered? The suppression of Gnostic texts did not erase their influence entirely. While the institutional church sought to establish a single, unified doctrine, Gnostic ideas lingered beneath the surface, resurfacing in various spiritual movements throughout history. Some of these groups openly challenged the church, while others quietly preserved esoteric traditions that bore striking similarities to the lost Gospels. One of the most notable echoes of Gnosticism appeared in medieval Europe, particularly in the beliefs of the Cathars, a religious sect that emerged in the 12th century. The Cathars, like the Gnostics before them, believed that the physical world was the creation of an evil force, and that true salvation came from rejecting material attachments and seeking spiritual enlightenment. They viewed the Catholic Church as corrupt and unnecessary, claiming that its teachings had strayed from the true message of Jesus. This direct challenge to church authority made the Cathars a target of persecution. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade, a brutal military campaign aimed at eradicating them. Entire towns were massacred, and Cathar beliefs were systematically stamped out. Yet despite the church's efforts, the ideas at the heart of the Cathar movement, like the rejection of worldly power and the emphasis on personal spiritual knowledge, continued to influence mystical traditions for centuries. Beyond the Cathars, other esoteric movements in Europe also reflected Gnostic themes. The Rosicrucians, an early modern secret society, spoke of hidden wisdom and spiritual transformation. The Kabbalists, though rooted in Jewish mysticism, explored concepts that paralleled Gnostic ideas about divine knowledge and the illusionary nature of the material world. Even in the Renaissance, scholars and philosophers began to reconsider long-forgotten texts, and whispers of Gnostic thought found their way into art, literature, and new interpretations of Christianity. But the most dramatic resurgence of Gnostic ideas came in the 20th century with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945. For nearly 1,600 years, these Gnostic writings have been buried, hidden from both church authorities and historians. Their rediscovery changed everything. Suddenly, scholars had access to texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Secret Book of John, documents that revealed a very different version of early Christianity than the one passed down through Orthodox tradition. The contents of these texts shocked many. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, did not present Jesus as a divine sacrifice, but as a teacher who guided his followers towards self-discovery. The Secret Book of John described a cosmic battle between higher spiritual forces and the false god of this world, aligning with the Gnostic belief that the physical universe was a prison created by a lower, imperfect being. These writings painted a picture of Christianity that was far more diverse and mystical than previously thought. As scholars analyzed these texts, debates erupted. Some argued that the Gnostic Gospels provided a more authentic account of Jesus' teachings than the canonical Gospels, which had been shaped by political and religious agendas. Others dismissed them as later distortions, claiming that they represented fringe beliefs rather than the true message of Jesus. The controversy only deepened as modern spiritual movements began incorporating Gnostic themes, blending them with contemporary ideas about enlightenment and personal awakening. But one thing was clear. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi text proved that early Christianity was far more complex than the traditional narrative suggested. It was not a single, unified faith, but a battlefield of competing ideas, each offering a different vision of who Jesus was and what his message meant. The version that survived and became dominant was not necessarily the only truth. It was simply the one that gained power and influence. The rediscovery of the Nag Hammadi texts opened a floodgate of questions, not only about the origins of Christianity, but also about the forces that shaped its development. Scholars and theologians found themselves confronting an uncomfortable reality. The early church had been far more divided than history had previously suggested. The Gnostic texts revealed a world where competing interpretations of Jesus coexisted, often in direct opposition to one another. With the Gospel of Thomas emphasizing self-knowledge and the Secret Book of John depicting a cosmic battle against a false god, it became clear that Gnostic Christians saw their faith not as a rigid institution, but as a deeply personal journey. Unlike the Orthodox tradition, which relied on priests and bishops to guide believers, Gnostic teachings suggested that each person had the potential to discover divine truth on their own. This idea, though revolutionary at the time, had profound implications for the way Christianity evolved. As these texts were translated and studied, a striking pattern emerged. Gnostic Christianity seemed to share similarities with Eastern philosophies. The emphasis on inner enlightenment, the illusion of the material world, and the idea that salvation comes from knowledge rather than faith echoed concepts found in Hinduism and Buddhism. Some scholars even speculated that early Christian mystics could have been influenced by these traditions, either through direct contact or through the broader exchange of ideas in the ancient world. This raised an even more controversial question. Was the Christianity that emerged in Rome and became the foundation of Western civilization the only legitimate version of the faith? Or had crucial aspects of Jesus' teachings been lost, or even deliberately erased by those in power? While academic circles debated these possibilities, the impact of the Nag Hammadi discovery extended beyond universities and churches. Modern spiritual movements, particularly in the New Age community, began embracing Gnostic ideas, seeing them as a purer form of Christianity, one that did not rely on institutional control, but instead encouraged personal exploration of the divine. Books and documentaries popularized the notion that Jesus may have been more of a mystical teacher than a figure of sacrifice. Some even suggested that his original message had been radically altered to serve the political ambitions of the early church. These ideas, though controversial, found an audience among those who felt disconnected from traditional religious structures. The Gnostic emphasis on direct experience over blind faith resonated with people seeking a more personal, mystical approach to spirituality. The notion that hidden truths had been buried by history only made these teachings more appealing. Yet despite this resurgence of interest, the mainstream church largely rejected any attempt to reintroduce Gnostic perspectives into Christian theology. The Vatican and other religious authorities continued to dismiss the Nag Hammadi texts as heretical, emphasizing that the official biblical canon represented the true and complete teachings of Jesus. But with so many alternative narratives now widely available, many began to question whether religious institutions had the authority to define the boundaries of faith. This tension between institutional Christianity and alternative interpretations did not stay confined to academic debates or spiritual movements. It began influencing popular culture, appearing in books, films, and even conspiracy theories. The idea that the church had hidden or suppressed vital knowledge about Jesus became a recurring theme in modern storytelling. Best-selling novels like The Da Vinci Code and historical documentaries fueled public curiosity about lost gospels, secret teachings, and the possibility that Christianity as we know it might be missing something essential. As these ideas spread, one fact became undeniable. Gnostic Christianity was no longer a forgotten chapter of history. It had returned, challenging long-held beliefs and forcing a new generation to reconsider the origins of their faith. The lost gospels had not only survived centuries of suppression, but had emerged more powerful than ever, raising fundamental questions about what it truly means to follow the teachings of Jesus. As the influence of Gnostic ideas spread in the modern era, scholars, theologians, and seekers alike found themselves drawn deeper into the question, what else had been lost, hidden, or intentionally erased from history? The Nag Hammadi texts had shattered the illusion of a single, unified early Christianity, revealing instead a complex, diverse spiritual landscape. But these discoveries also raised another unsettling possibility. If Gnostic texts had been buried for centuries, what other knowledge might still remain undiscovered? This search for hidden truths led researchers to re-examine ancient Christian sites, early manuscripts, and even the political forces that shaped the development of Christianity. Archaeologists and historians scoured monasteries, desert caves, and forgotten libraries, hoping to uncover more suppressed writings. While nothing as dramatic as the Nag Hammadi find had emerged, scattered references in ancient texts hinted that other lost gospels and alternative Christian traditions may have once existed. Some of the most intriguing clues came from early church writings themselves. Orthodox Christian leaders like Irenaeus and Tertullian had condemned a wide range of texts and teachings as heretical. Yet in doing so, they had inadvertently preserved the names of writings that no longer existed. These included lost books like the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Egyptians, and the Gospel of the 12, all of which were referenced by early Christian writers but had never been found. What secrets might these missing works contain? Other researchers turn their attention to the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947 near the ancient settlement of Qumran. While these texts were not explicitly Christian, they were written by a Jewish sect known as the Essenes. Some scholars suggested that they might contain ideas that influenced early Christianity. The Essenes had a strong focus on duality, purity, and the coming of a divine figure who would challenge corrupt religious authorities. This sounded remarkably similar to certain Gnostic themes, leading some to wonder whether Jesus himself had connections to this mysterious group. As investigations continued, another controversial theory emerged: the possibility that the early church had deliberately altered or omitted key teachings of Jesus to consolidate its authority. Some scholars pointed to discrepancies in the four canonical Gospels, suggesting that certain elements may have been changed to fit theological and political needs. Others questioned whether important figures such as Mary Magdalene had been intentionally downplayed or misrepresented. The Gospel of Mary, found in the late 19th century but largely ignored until recent decades, painted Mary not as a mere follower but as one of Jesus' closest disciples, perhaps even his most trusted one. If this was true, why had her role been diminished in Orthodox tradition? These discoveries and debates reignited centuries-old conflicts between religious institutions and those who sought a deeper, alternative understanding of Christian origins. The Church, as it had done in the past, dismissed many of these claims as speculation or misinterpretation. But outside of traditional religious circles, interest in Gnostic Christianity surged. Spiritual seekers, disillusioned with organized religion, found comfort in the idea of a Jesus who encouraged personal enlightenment rather than blind obedience. With interest in Gnostic Christianity growing, the conversation shifted beyond religious scholarship and into the broader cultural and philosophical landscape. The more people explored the implications of these rediscovered texts, the more they began questioning the very foundations of Christian belief and the narratives that had been passed down through centuries. One of the most controversial discussions centered around the idea of hidden knowledge, the notion that spiritual truth was not meant for everyone, but was instead reserved for those who were ready to receive it. This was a core Gnostic belief, yet it stood in direct opposition to the teachings of institutional Christianity, which promoted salvation through faith in Jesus' death and resurrection. If the Gnostics were right, then much of what had been considered central to Christian doctrine could have been a later construction, designed more for control than enlightenment. This concept resonated with modern spiritual movements, particularly those influenced by Eastern traditions. Some began to see parallels between Gnostic teachings and ideas found in Hinduism and Buddhism, especially the belief that the material world was an illusion and that spiritual liberation came from transcending physical existence. The idea that divine wisdom was hidden from the masses and accessible only to those who actively sought it also bore similarities to esoteric traditions like Kabbalah, Sufism, and certain strands of mystical Christianity. Yet these ideas also sparked resistance. Traditional Christian scholars argued that Gnosticism was a deviation from Jesus' original message, not a hidden truth waiting to be rediscovered. They pointed to the fact that the Church Fathers had condemned Gnostic teachings as dangerous distortions and insisted that the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, offered the most authentic account of Jesus' life and teachings. For them, the lost Gospels of Nag Hammadi were not sacred revelations, but remnants of a movement that had died out for good reason. But history had shown that religious movements rarely die completely. Instead, they evolve, adapt, and resurface in new forms. And as more people began questioning institutional narratives, the ideas within Gnostic texts took on new significance. Some wondered whether the suppression of these beliefs had been an attempt to limit spiritual autonomy, to prevent individuals from seeking direct communion with the divine outside the authority of religious leaders. This led to renewed interest in the role of power in shaping religious doctrine. The early church councils, particularly the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, were reevaluated not just as theological gatherings, but as political events. If certain beliefs had been declared heretical and excluded from the official canon, was this purely for spiritual reasons, or had it been a strategic move to unify a fragmented faith under a single doctrine? The more people examined the historical context, the more it seemed that decisions about what counted as true Christianity had been influenced as much by politics as by divine revelation. This re-examination of history also brought renewed focus to the figures who had been marginalized or erased from the Christian story. The case of Mary Magdalene remained one of the most debated topics. The canonical Gospels mentioned her as one of Jesus' followers, but the Gnostic text portrayed her as someone much more significant, a spiritual leader, perhaps even the recipient of Jesus' most profound teachings. Some speculated that her diminished role in Orthodox tradition was a deliberate effort to suppress female leadership in the early church. As the rediscovery of Gnostic texts continued to challenge long-held beliefs, the conversation turned toward an even deeper question. If the early church had actively shaped the narrative of Jesus' life and teachings, what else had been altered or omitted from history? Scholars and independent researchers started scrutinizing ancient Christian traditions, searching for patterns that might reveal more hidden aspects of the faith. One area that drew intense interest was the evolving role of Jesus himself. The Jesus of the canonical Gospels was depicted primarily as a divine Savior, the Son of God who came to redeem humanity through his death and resurrection. But the Jesus found in Gnostic writings was different, less of a sacrificial figure and more of a mystical teacher. He spoke in riddles, encouraged self-discovery, and, in some texts, even suggested that salvation was not about his death at all, but about understanding the true nature of reality. This idea struck at the very core of Christian doctrine. If Jesus' mission was not about atonement for sin, but about awakening divine knowledge within each individual, then the foundation of Orthodox Christianity, original sin, salvation through faith, and the need for a church to mediate between God and humanity began to crumble. It raised an unsettling possibility. Had the institutional church built its power on a misrepresentation of Jesus' teachings? These revelations led to renewed discussions about how early Christian leaders might have deliberately shaped doctrine to serve their own needs. The Roman Empire's role in the spread of Christianity became a focal point. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and later helped establish it as the empire's dominant faith, the religion underwent a dramatic transformation. What had once been a diverse and sometimes persecuted movement now became aligned with imperial power. But with that alignment came standardization. Certain beliefs were elevated, while others, especially those that challenged hierarchical authority, were suppressed. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD was a key moment in this process. It was here that Christian leaders, under Constantine's influence, debated fundamental aspects of the faith, including the nature of Jesus. The outcome was the Nicene Creed, which declared Jesus as fully divine and eternally one with God. But what about the voices that disagreed? Some scholars argued that competing interpretations of Jesus, ones that emphasized his human wisdom rather than his divine status, were actively erased from history. This idea was further supported by the fate of certain Christian sects that had existed before Nicaea. Groups like the Ebionites, who saw Jesus as a great prophet but not as God, gradually disappeared, their teachings condemned as heresy. The same was true for many Gnostic groups. Their belief that divine knowledge could be accessed without the church's authority made them a direct threat to the emerging Christian hierarchy. By the end of the 4th century, the Roman-backed church had gained enough power to enforce its version of Christianity across the empire. Alternative traditions were not just discouraged, they were destroyed. This led to another unsettling realization. If Christianity had been shaped by political forces as much as by faith, then modern believers might be following a version of Jesus that had been carefully curated to serve institutional goals. This was not to say that Christianity itself was false, but rather that its history was far more complex than most had been taught. It suggested that much of what people believed about Jesus today had been influenced by decisions made over 1,000 years ago. Decisions that had little to do with spirituality and everything to do with control. The growing awareness of this lost history had a profound effect. People began re-examining their own faith, questioning what they had been taught, and searching for a deeper understanding of Jesus beyond church doctrine. Some turned to Gnostic texts for inspiration, finding in them a version of Christianity that emphasized personal transformation over obedience to religious institutions. Others sought out connections between Gnostic ideas and modern spirituality, exploring how ancient teachings on inner enlightenment could still be relevant today. As more discoveries were made and more questions were asked, one thing became clear. The story of Christianity was far from settled. The past still held secrets, and those secrets had the power to reshape everything people thought they knew about faith, truth, and the figure of Jesus himself. As more people questioned the origins of Christian doctrine, the focus shifted to how these suppressed teachings might have influenced other religious and philosophical traditions. If Gnostic ideas had been deliberately erased from mainstream Christianity, had they survived elsewhere, hidden in plain sight? Some researchers believe they had, tracing elements of Gnostic thought through history and mystical movements across different cultures. One of the most striking parallels was found in the rise of esoteric Christianity during the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Secretive groups like the Cathars in medieval France embraced beliefs that closely resembled Gnostic teachings. They viewed the material world as corrupt, rejected the authority of the established church, and taught that salvation came from inner enlightenment rather than from external rituals. The Catholic Church saw them as a dangerous threat, launching brutal campaigns, such as the Albigensian Crusade, to wipe them out. Despite this persecution, echoes of Gnostic thought continued to resurface. The Renaissance saw a revival of interest in mystical traditions, with scholars exploring ancient texts that had been forgotten for centuries. Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and alchemy all contained themes similar to Gnostic beliefs, particularly the idea that divine wisdom was hidden and could only be accessed by those who sought it. Some historians argued that these traditions preserved elements of lost Gnostic Christianity, keeping its core ideas alive even as the Church tried to erase them. During the Enlightenment, when science and reason began challenging traditional religious authority, new interpretations of Jesus emerged. Some thinkers proposed that Jesus was not a divine savior, but a radical philosopher whose teachings had been distorted over time. This view aligned with Gnostic texts that depicted Jesus as a revealer of hidden knowledge rather than a sacrificial figure. In the 19th and 20th centuries, this perspective gained momentum as scholars began questioning the historical accuracy of the Gospels and searching for alternative sources of Christian history. Then came one of the most significant moments in this search, the rediscovery of the Nag Hammadi texts in 1945. These documents provided undeniable proof that early Christianity had been far more diverse than previously believed. For the first time in centuries, modern readers could see firsthand how different Jesus' message appeared in Yemen Gnostic writings compared to the version taught by the Church. This discovery reignited debates about what had been lost and why, sparking a resurgence of interest in alternative Christianities. At the same time, the rise of modern spirituality created a new space for Gnostic ideas to flourish. The 20th and 21st centuries saw a growing rejection of institutional religion in favor of personal spiritual experiences. Concepts like self-realization, divine wisdom, and inner transformation, once dismissed as heretical, became central to many modern spiritual movements. Some even speculated that the popularity of meditation, mindfulness, and consciousness-expanding practices reflected a subconscious revival of Gnostic thought.